This is excerpted from the Mises Institute's article, Immigration Roundtable, Hans Hermann Hoppe. We start with his seminal 1998 article from the Journal of Libertarian Studies titled The Case for Free Trade and Restricted Immigration, where Hoppe first challenges the analogy between trade restrictions on goods and immigration restrictions. I will argue that this thesis and its implicit claim are fundamentally mistaken. In particular, I will demonstrate that free trade and restricted immigration are not only perfectly consistent, but even mutually reinforcing policies. That is, it is not the advocates of free trade and restricted immigration who are wrong, but rather the proponents of free trade and free immigration. In thus taking the intellectual guilt out of the free trade and restricted immigration position and putting it where it actually belongs, I hope to promote a change in the present state of public opinion and facilitate substantial political realignment. Because goods and people are not the same thing, Hoppe argues, even a provable overall increase in national income does not address the subjective nature of wealth. From the outset, it must be emphasized that not even the most restrictive immigration policy or the most exclusive form of segregationism has anything to do with a rejection of free trade and the adoption of protectionism. From the fact that one does not want to associate with or live in the neighborhood composed of Mexicans, Haitians, Chinese, Koreans, Germans, Catholics, Muslims, Hindus, etc., it does not follow that one does not want to trade with them from a distance. Moreover, even if it were the case that one's real income would rise as a result of immigration, it does not follow that immigration must be considered good, for material wealth is not the only thing that counts. Rather, what constitutes welfare or wealth is subjective, and one might prefer lower material living standards and a greater distance from certain other people over higher material living standards and a smaller distance. It is precisely the absolute voluntariness of human association and separation, the absence of any form of forced integration, which makes peaceful relationships, free trade between racially, ethnically, linguistically, religiously, or culturally distinct people possible. Furthermore, the incentive to emigrate from low-wage countries to higher-wage countries is reduced by free trade policies. The relationship between trade and migration is one of elastic substitutability rather than rigid exclusivity. The more or less you have of one, the less or more you need of the other. Other things being equal, businesses move to low-wage areas and labor moves to high-wage areas, thus effecting a tendency toward the equalization of wage rates for the same kind of labor as well as the optimal localization of capital. With political borders separating high from low-wage areas and with nationwide trade and immigration policies in effect, these normal tendencies of immigration and capital export are weakened with free trade and strengthened with protectionism. As long as Mexican products, the products of a low-wage area, can freely enter a high-wage area such as the US, the incentive for Mexican people to move to the US is reduced. In contrast, if Mexican products are prevented from entering the American market, the attraction for Mexican workers to move to the US is increased. Similarly, when US producers are free to buy from and sell to Mexican producers and consumers, capital exports from the US to Mexico will be reduced. However, when US producers are prevented from doing so, the attraction of moving production from the US to Mexico is increased. Hoppe then makes his critical distinction between invited goods imported by a willing buyer and an individual's desire to move at will. Uninvited mass migration, he argues, frequently makes one party or parties, current inhabitants of the recipient nation, subjectively worse off in their view. Thus, immigration is not always analogous to win-win trade exchanges. The phenomena of trade and immigration are different in a fundamental respect, and the meaning of free and restricted in conjunction with both terms is categorically different. People can move and migrate. Goods and services of themselves cannot. Put differently, while someone can migrate from one place to another without anyone else wanting him to do so, goods and services cannot be shipped from place to place unless both sender and receiver agree. Trivial as this distinction may appear, it has momentous consequences. For free in conjunction with trade then means trade by invitation of private households and firms only, and restricted trade does not mean protection of households and firms from uninvited goods or services, but invasion and abrogation of the right of private households and firms to extend or deny invitations to their own property. In contrast, free in conjunction with immigration does not mean immigration by invitation of individual households and firms, but unwanted invasion or forced integration. And restricted immigration actually means, or at least can mean, the protection of private households and firms from unwanted invasion and forced integration. Hence, in advocating free trade and restricted immigration, one follows the same principle. requiring an invitation for people as for goods and services. However, with respect to the movement of people, the same government will have to do more in order to fulfill its protective functions than merely permit events to take their own course, because people, unlike products, possess a will and can migrate. Accordingly, population movements, unlike product shipments, are not per se mutually beneficial events because they are not always necessarily and invariably the result of an agreement between a specific receiver and sender. Furthermore, the reality of modern welfare states means that an influx of people, unlike an influx of goods, can be disastrous. According to proponents of unconditional free immigration, the US, qua high-wage area, would invariably benefit from free immigration. Hence, it should enact a policy of open borders regardless of any existing conditions, i.e. even if the US were ensnarled in protectionism and domestic welfare. Yet surely, such a proposal strikes a reasonable person as fantastic. Assume that the US, or better still Switzerland, declared that there would no longer be any border controls, that anyone who could pay the fare might enter the country and as a resident then be entitled to every normal domestic welfare provision. Can there be any doubt how disastrous such an experiment would turn out in the present world? The US and Switzerland even faster would be overrun by millions of third world immigrants because life on and off American and Swiss public streets is comfortable compared to life in many areas of the third world. Welfare costs would skyrocket and the strangled economy disintegrate and collapse as the subsistence fund, the stock of capital accumulated in and inherited from the past, was plundered. Civilization in the US and Switzerland would vanish, just as it once did from Rome and Greece. What then is Hoppe's answer to the essential conflict posed by immigration rules, i.e. the desires of some residents of a country to permit immigration and the desire of others to prohibit it? Not open borders, he says, which are inconsistent and contradictory. Some immigration restrictions must exist, but what restrictions? The only consistent and workable answer to that question is nothing less than a full anarcho-capitalist model for property, where private owners invite immigrants onto their property after assessing the benefits and costs. Neither forced integration nor forced exclusion should be permissible. The guiding principle of a high-wage area country's immigration policy follows from the insight that immigration, to be free in the same sense as trade is free, must be invited immigration. The details follow from the further elucidation and exemplification of the concept of invitation versus invasion and forced integration. For this purpose, it is necessary to assume first as a conceptual benchmark the existence of what political philosophers have described as a private property anarchy, anarcho-capitalism or ordered anarchy. All land is privately owned, including all streets, rivers, airports, harbors, etc. With respect to some pieces of land, the property title may be unrestricted, that is, the owner is permitted to do with his property whatever he pleases as long as he does not physically damage the property of others. With respect to other territories, the property title may be more or less restricted. As is currently the case in some developments, the owner may be bound by contractual limitations on what he can do with his property, restrictive covenants, voluntary zoning, which might include residential rather than commercial use, no buildings more than 4 stories high, no sale or rent to unmarried couples, smokers or Germans, for instance. Clearly, in this kind of society, there is no such thing as freedom of immigration or an immigrant's right of way. What does exist is the freedom of independent private property owners to admit or exclude others from their own property in accordance with their own restricted or unrestricted property titles. Admission to some territories might be easy, while to others it might be nearly impossible. Moreover, admission to one party's property does not imply the freedom to move around unless other property owners have agreed to such movements. There will be as much immigration or non-immigration, inclusivity or exclusivity, desegregation or segregation, non-discrimination or discrimination, as individual owners or owners' associations desire. When government intrudes, however, with its arbitrary borders and sanctioned passports, bureaucrats rather than invested property owners make the immigration rules. Thus, what ought to be a private system becomes political. In order to realize what this involves, it is necessary to explain how an anarcho-capitalist society is altered by the introduction of a government, and how this affects the immigration problem. Since in an anarcho-capitalist society there is no government, there is no clear-cut distinction between inlanders, domestic citizens, and foreigners. This distinction appears only with the establishment of a government. The territory which a government's power extends over then becomes inland, and everyone residing outside of this territory becomes a foreigner. State borders and passports, as distinct from private property borders and titles to property, come into existence, and immigration takes on a new meaning. Immigration becomes immigration by foreigners across state borders, and the decision as to whether or not a person should be admitted no longer rests exclusively with private property owners or associations of such owners, but with the government qua domestic security producer. Now, if the government excludes a person while there exists a domestic resident who wants to admit this very person onto his property, the result is forced exclusion. And if the government admits a person while there exists no domestic resident who wants to have this person on his property, the result is forced integration. How would a process of invited immigrants work per Hoppe? Through contractual admission, which in effect makes the inviting party the sponsor of such immigrants. Qua contractual admission, the inviting party can dispose only of his own private property. Hence, the admission implies negatively, similarly to the scenario of conditional free immigration, that the immigrant is excluded from all publicly funded welfare. Positively, it implies that the receiving party assumes legal responsibility for the actions of his invitee for the duration of his stay. The inviter is held liable to the full extent of his property for any crimes the invitee commits against the person or property of any third party, as parents are held accountable for the crimes of their offspring as long as they are members of the parental household. This obligation, which implies, practically speaking, that invitors will have to carry liability insurance for all of their guests, ends once the invitee has left the country, or once another domestic property owner has assumed liability for the person in question by admitting him onto his property. The invitation may be private, personal, or commercial, temporally limited or unlimited, concerning only housing, accommodation, residency, or housing and employment, but there cannot be a valid contract involving only employment and no housing. In any case, however, as a contractual relationship, every invitation may be revoked or terminated by the inviter, and upon termination, the invitee, whether tourist, visiting businessman, or resident alien, will be required to leave the country unless another resident citizen enters an invitation contract with him. Dr. Hoppe closes the article with an admonition against the automatic grant of voting and citizenship rights to immigrants. Becoming a citizen means acquiring the right to stay in a country permanently, and a permanent invitation cannot be secured other than by purchasing residential property from a citizen resident. Only by selling real estate to a foreigner does a citizen indicate that he agrees to a guest's permanent stay, and only if the immigrant has purchased and paid for real estate and residential housing in the host country will he assume a permanent interest in his new country's well-being and prosperity. Moreover, finding a citizen willing to sell residential property and being prepared and able to pay for it, although a necessary requirement for the acquisition of citizenship, may not also be sufficient. If and insofar as the domestic property in question is subject to restrictive covenants, the hurdles to be taken by a prospective citizen may be significantly higher. In Switzerland, for instance, citizenship may require that the sale of residential property to foreigners be ratified by a majority of or even all directly affected local property owners.